Welcome to the Data Stream, the podcast that dives deep into the fast-moving currents of data, technology, and the law. BakerHostetler's Digital Assets and Data Management Practice Group, DADM, brings you this series, hosted by partners David Sherman and Nichole Sterling, to explore how companies navigate the complex and often intertwined lifecycle of data, from privacy and cybersecurity to advertising, AI, and other emerging technologies. I'm Charlie May, and you are listening to Baker Hosts. On today's episode, David and Nichole speak with Daniel Kaufman, a partner in BakerHostetler's Washington, D.C. office. Daniel is a member of our advertising, marketing, and digital media team. Before joining BakerHostetler, Daniel spent more than 20 years with the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection.
Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today, especially on a Friday afternoon in December. We are thrilled to welcome you to the podcast, and I look forward to badgering you for the next 30 minutes or so, along with Nichole.
Very excited because Daniel's own podcast with Amy Mudge is one of our favorites.
I could not be happier to be here talking to both of you.
Why, thank you so much. So let's start with a terribly hard question. What is a current marketing trend that you think is overrated? And maybe one that you think is underrated.
Again, thanks for having me here. This is so much fun. I'm really jazzed to be here with both of you. So the first thing, I don't know if it's a trend, but it's just something I hate more than anything. And it is, I spend a lot of time online. I spend more time on TikTok than I should. And anytime you have someone with long nails tapping onto a product, it's constant on TikTok and it drives me insane. Not a trend, but I want it gone. But more broadly at other stuff, look, I think really obvious product placement is jarring. So I think that is just something that has to be done really careful and organically. And forced authenticity. It's funny, there's so much of a focus on authenticity in advertising, and you can really tell when it's authentic and when it isn't. And trying to recreate that very often fails. But on the flip side, and I think what is underrated, like two things strike me. Actually, I think authenticity is underrated. But really transparency. Consumers aren't looking to be deceived, to not know if someone's being compensated for a presentation or something. And I think transparency is something that is underrated and people try to avoid it and skirt it. But I think consumers really do relish not being lied to.
I think both given your past as a regulator and also just being a decent person, I couldn't agree more. I do have one really important follow-up though. When you refer to the tapping, do you mean the act of literal tapping or is it the noise? Which one of the two things? Which do you find more grating?
I think the noise is more grating. If it was just the tapping and I couldn't hear the tapping noise with it, I'd probably be less annoyed. But yeah, the combo of the two is really bad.
And then a follow-up to that as well. If we were to think about the tapping itself and your comment about authenticity, would it change? Is it the timbre of the tap if you're tapping with like acrylic nails as opposed to real nails?
I think most of these are acrylic. I am pretty confident the ones that I'm seeing are acrylic, and maybe the sound is different, but I'll check with one of my colleagues on that and get back to you.
Fair enough. Pivoting then to, again, thinking about the concept of fairness, right, and transparency to the market. Given your history at the FTC, leading consumer protection efforts on behalf of a major agency. And I know you've been with us with Baker for a long time within the advertising, marketing, and digital media practice. But if you were pitching the AMDM team to a brand legal team these days, what's the elevator pitch? And what's something that we do that most other firms don't?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Look, I really do and respect the firms that compete with us. I think they all do really good work. A lot of them lean into either sort of regulatory practice or transactional work. But I think Baker is really a powerhouse in both. And that I do think is a differentiator. We've got a real broad breadth of experience within the leadership here. We've got in-house people, me from the government. We've got people with decades of private practice experience. And I think we're large enough to have a broad amount of expertise, but also small enough to be nimble and be able to do just those quick confabs that get us to the right solutions as quickly as we can. So I think those are differentiators. The second thing is just where we are placed. It is a little bit unusual that the advertising practice is placed within the broader digital assets and data management practice. And that has been an enormous benefit for us. We are all steeped in privacy and data issues, but when we need the deeper expertise, we've got an easy home of people here we can access, including the two of you, to help us when we get some of the thorny privacy issues, which are now so commingled with virtually every advertising issue.
So I have a question about your time at the FTC. We know you were there for 23 years, I believe, more than 2 decades at any rate, at the Bureau of Consumer Protection. So we're going to assume you know a lot about the FTC. So here's what we want to know. We want to know what the private practice attorneys get wrong about the FTC. So people who are coming from private practice, they've never worked at the FTC. What do they get wrong? What's the truth? Are we all imagining the regulators are having secret meetings about who to find next?
There's a lot that the private practice gets wrong. I think the starting point is, though, I've had a lot of experiences where people underestimate the talent and experience of people at the agency. There are hordes of people at the FTC that could be in private practice in companies making lots more money who have chosen this career in public service to do this work. And they're talented, they're smart, and they understand things. So I think that is a misimpression I see far too often, unfortunately. The second thing is I think the outside bar sometimes will underestimate the importance of civility when you're dealing certainly with the FTC or other agencies. And sometimes there is this belief that you want to have this bombastic outside counsel, and some clients might feel better with that. But it doesn't really help you big picture. And I think you can be civil and aggressive with your regulator. And I think that is something that is very respected within the agency.
So taking that into sort of real life practice here, what helps? We all have this tendency to think that FTC investigations get started, they turn into these giant multi-year sort of things that are long and drawn out for companies. What actually helps them wrap up quickly? Because we all know that there are many things that happen behind the scenes that we just never hear of that are quick investigations, and then there are these multi-year ones. So what are some of the things that really distinguish in that space?
Yeah. Look, at the outset, some of it is luck of the draw. There are one of the strengths and weaknesses of the FTC that it's traditionally very staff driven. And you've got some staff that are really efficient, really good at focusing on key issues. And there are some staff that feel the need to explore every nook and cranny. And there is an element of luck of the draw, absolutely. But I do think taking advantage of the opportunities that you have to educate staff, once you have a better sense of what are they focusing on, what's the direction, create these opportunities, whether it's the creation of a short white paper, or there are times where it can be helpful to offer staff, look, you're interested in this issue, we've got an in-house expert at the company, we'd love to have you talk to them. Again, something short of a deposition, less formal. Obviously, you prepare them very heavily, but taking advantage of those opportunities to educate staff, I think can really be helpful, maybe not to make it go away, but to at least narrow the issues, because that is one trend we are seeing. As FTC is very rarely exploring one issue about a company. Usually you're seeing a CID that has multiple issues, and if you can wipe off some of them, that is to your benefit, and we'll shorten things.
Again, to that end, you just mentioned a CID. What about before we're looking at a CID? Meaning, are there ways in which we can bring a company's expertise or personalities or roles or maybe even outside counsel experience to bear to try and forego a formal investigation?
Look, that's going to be really fact dependent. If, for example, your company is in the news for something that you think will likely be of interest to the FTC, it is absolutely worth thinking about. Is there an opportunity here to reach out to the relevant bureau or part of the agency to let them know what's going on? If you're seeing misimpressions about what is happening to your company, it may be worth considering reaching out to the FTC in order to stave something off. I will say there are parts of the agency that will, before they fully open an investigation, will send you a letter that says, hey, looks like we're investigating you, stop destroying documents. Take advantage of that opportunity. Reach out to the person, try to set up a meeting to understand their concerns and have a presentation ready, again, explaining why this is not an FTC issue. You don't need to worry about that. It's under control, whatever the issue might be. But I do think if you have this sense or understanding that something is going to be of interest to the agency, really talk to an FTC expert to see whether a reach out might be a good course of action.
Fair enough. And to that end, that's great advice for, again, the market. But if you were to flip the table for a minute, if you were advising the FTC, what enforcement priorities would you recommend for the next 12 to 18 months in advertising and privacy? What risks should they focus on right now?
I will say, when I look at the cases that are currently coming out of the FTC, I think I'm very happy with what I'm seeing mostly. Look, there are some cases I might disagree on, but there seems to be much more of a focus on real harm to consumers, money out of pocketbooks, and not theoretical harms. And I do think those are the kind of the cases where when consumers are paying for something that doesn't work or being tricked into giving up their money in circumstances that are unknown to them, I think those are the really good FTC cases where the harm is not theoretical. I think the other things I would throw in is I'm always going to be the biggest cheerleader for FTC staff, but listen to your staff, engage with them. I think critically, of course, as they all do, but staff have a deep amount of expertise that should be listened to. And finally, I know the FCC did issue a lot of new rules in the past few years. Be mindful of how those are being enforced and enforce them in a reasonable manner. I don't think we want to take those rules and stretch them as far as humanly possible. I do think we'll see some cases coming out from all the new rules that the FTC put forth in the last administration, but I think we got to be really mindful of how we're approaching and enforcing those rules.
Fair enough. So we just talked about what should they look at on a forward-looking basis, but let's do a bit of a retrospective for a minute. So like from the days of VHS to streaming now, how do you think the agencies, or the FTC in particular's view of consumer harm shifted from classic deception or unfairness to data-driven harms like manipulation and dark patterns and certainly kids' privacy? And what are the practical takeaways for marketers today?
The thing that always marvels me about the FTC is that you've got this decades-old statute, this prohibition on deception and unfairness that, again, it was created before we were even thinking of the internet. And it has been flexible and nimble enough to be used in all sorts of situations, from deceptive TV advertising in the 80s to infomercials to current issues about how companies are marketing their AI products. So I've always marveled at the flexibility of that tool to address these concerns. And certainly one of the things Chairman Ferguson has said when it comes to privacy is, look, it's a helpful statute. I'm paraphrasing him, of course. It's a helpful statute. There's a lot it can do with deception and unfairness, but it is not a national privacy statute. There are limits to how far you can stretch that authority. And I think that, to me, is a big focus for the FTC, is how far can you interpret the FTC Act and use it for privacy practices without going beyond the bounds of what is reasonable for this very flexible statute.
Let's talk a little bit about environmental and green claims. So things that are eco-friendly and also country of origin stuff. So made in the USA, I know, is a popular challenging claim as well.
So where do brands fall into substantiation traps? And where does the reasonable consumer's view diverge from legal assumptions?
In some ways, it's funny. I like the question, Nichole, but I think the question is giving me the answer. The FTC focus is on consumer perception and consumer understanding. And that's where companies, I do think, can get confused. When you look at green claims, and this is a core FTC philosophy, is if you claim that a product is earth-friendly or green, there is a huge breadth of interpretations that consumers will take away from that. They're going to think it's biodegradable, it's recyclable, whatever it might be. And that is the core concept. When you're in that green space, the general consensus is that consumers are going to broadly interpret your claims. So you have to be very mindful of what you're saying, because specifically consumer perception in that area is going to be far more broad than you might think. And the FTC is aware of that, and that's underlying certainly the green guides. Made in the USA is a little bit similar. I think it's a hard concept for consumers to understand what it means to be made in the USA. An area we've seen companies get confused sometimes is that concept of country of origin is very different than, do you have enough substantiation to make a claim that your product is made in the USA? There's a very high bar to reach on that. Actually, Amy and I have a podcast coming out soon on Made in the USA issues. But the bar is very high. And you can make, of course, a Made in the USA claim, but companies need to think, do I meet that standard? And is there a sort of qualified claim that's a little bit softer that I can make that would be lower risk? But I do think the starting point for almost all of the FTC analysis is exactly consumer perception. What are they understanding? And very often when you test them, they understand things very differently than you might predict.
So is that where we get into things like where you see a company say designed in the USA, made in Vietnam?
Exactly. That is a nice qualified claim that gives you enough information to avoid that broad made in the USA claim and gives consumers information that is helpful without making an overly broad claim.
I was just thinking about a label I saw on the back of, I can't remember what it was, but some Black Friday sale piece of technology that said component parts manufactured in Cambodia. And I was like, that is a lot of language to include on the back of a package. What happened to this company? What was the discussion that led to that happening?
It's interesting. One of the good things there are many good things about the FTC. I stayed there for 23 years for a lot of reasons, but they have a really good Made in the USA program that works with a lot of companies to, instead of just jumping into a lawsuit, to really try to fix a behavior and just go back and forth and reach out to companies and engage and get them to improve their practices and use sort of warning letters instead of immediate law enforcement. And I think there's a lot of good business guidance the FTC has put out, specifically in the Made in the USA area. The other thing that just fascinates me about Made in the USA is there's so many different constituencies that care deeply about the issue. It's a deeply bipartisan issue for a variety of different reasons. So no matter who's running the agency, you're always going to see Made in the USA work.
I'm curious, Daniel, I know you are a huge fan of 80s pop culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And as a geriatric millennial, as someone called, and I think that title holds true for Chairman Ferguson as well.
Remember the 80s?
Yes, I do, for that matter. I'm curious, though. I want to do an 80s pop culture lightning round. And I'm curious, just again, and given my age of remembering at least the second half of the 80s, which one of these I'll actually get. So would you be up for it?
There's nothing I'd rather do than this.
Fair enough. All right. So to start, if you could bring back one 80s commercial jingle, what is it?
Okay, there's two I want. Kit Kat, Give Me a Break, the Give Me a Break song, break me off a bit of that Kit Kat bar. I love that one. And the Calgon Bath, Take Me Away. Not quite a jingle, but it is a slogan that I just thought was always amazing.
I don't even know if they make Calgon anymore, but I still remember Calgon. Okay, so next question. Columbia House. Tapes for a Penny offers classic value, early dark pattern. Did you buy Columbia House?
I absolutely bought Columbia House. Classic value. I got those 10 cassettes for a penny. I knew the deal I struck. I think they're probably still going to come after me at some point, and maybe I'll start having nightmares about this now. But no, it's an amazing deal. Maybe there was a dark pattern element here, one could argue, but I think we all knew that at some point they were going to hit us up for those 1698 not CDs, cassettes.
Cassettes. They're going to come back. You're going to have to buy a cassette like in 2026.
I have a few lying around at home in a box somewhere, I think.
And by the way, for anyone who doesn't know what a dark pattern is, quick definition if that's possible, Daniel.
Oh, absolutely. Look, it's funny. We're not hearing that term coming out of the FTC anymore since the change in the administration. They care about the concept, but not the term.
It's consumer privacy laws. The regulators love dark patterns.
Yeah, look, it is generally an online interface that leads consumers down a specific path that may be to their detriment. It's when companies are making options for consumers and there's a clear desire to push them in one direction versus the other, and they're using design techniques to accomplish that.
So like a green button versus a red button.
It can be something as simple as that.
So bringing us back to the lightning round, Columbia House tapes for a penny, no chance whatsoever that leads us to a bad or detrimental consumer path.
Okay, you could argue that, Dave.
Nope, I have more. So while I certainly owned dual cassette players that I maybe or maybe didn't use to burn things, or not burn things, what's the word? Record and copy. Anyway, back to the lightning round. And Columbia House is good for everybody. We'll just go with that. That is not an endorsement. So the FTC of 1985 reviews a modern AI-generated ad. What's the one margin note that they'd write?
I think the margin note would be 6 fingers ? I think there'd be an element of what is going on here? What is this image that we're seeing? Again, there would be nothing deceptive about it necessarily, but I do think when you look at what the images look like, obviously sometimes we've got 6 fingers, the sort of excessive touching up that we see that sort of can create images that are like, is this person human? What is going on here? Again, I think we're not at the point where we're seeing necessarily AI-generated ads that are making deceptive claims about what products can do. I think the FTC is going to focus on that eventually, but I think they would marvel at some of the just visual oddities.
All right, so best 80s celebrity endorsement. And why is it generally Mr. T endorsing anything? And would you greenlight it today?
Okay, the best, and it's a bit of a niche one, but I sometimes can be a little niche. In the mid-'80s, Andy Warhol and Debbie Harry did this amazing endorsement for the Commodore PC, the Amiga 1000, and wasn't particularly popular, didn't go anywhere, but I just thought that concept of Andy Warhol and Debbie Harry together endorsing a product is pretty amazing, and I wish I could do that again today, but I'd love to do that equivalent. Or Jane Fonda and her fitness equipment. Again, I'd love to see a resurgence of that. There's some bad examples from the 80s we can talk about also if you wanted to.
Sure. Give us your favorite bad example.
You got Bill Cosby endorsing a certain soft drink. I think we don't want to necessarily see that happening. There was the Brooke Shields ad for a big fashion brand that was, let's just say, inappropriate for her age at the time. There is a lot of stuff that was happening in the 80s that was questionable.
Fair enough. Speaking of things that are less questionable, favorite 1980s movie product placement, and could you still do it now?
The granddaddy of them all. It was E.T. and Reese's Pieces. M&M's had the chance. They didn't take it. Reese's Pieces did. Their sales exploded. It was brilliantly done. It felt organic at the time. And people were like, what is this candy? I got to try it. And it is quite amazing. And I really think that movie changed a lot of things.
I have to say that I'm pretty sure the entire reason I still eat Reese's Pieces periodically is because of E.T. All right. So back to a couple of wrap-up questions now that we're done with our fun lightning round. So looking ahead, 2026, recording this almost at the end of 2025, will be released as our first podcast of 2026. What are some of the emerging FTC themes that we should be watching most closely? I know this has been a sort of transition year with the new administration. What's come out of it? What are people really paying attention to?
So the first big issue, we really haven't seen where the FTC is going to land, but Chairman Ferguson has talked a lot about his concerns about online content and suppression of content and deplatforming. They issued a request for information about that, but we haven't yet seen what the FTC is going to do. Are they going to do a report? Are they going to do enforcement? Are they going to do some sort of proposed rule even? I think that issue of where the FTC is going to really dig in on content, that's one that's it's not quite keeping me up at night because I sleep really well, but really interested to see where that's going to land. The other thing is a little bit more new. In a recent settlement in the rental industry, Chairman Ferguson indicated that he had asked staff to start a rulemaking on deceptive fees in the rental industry, the home rental industry. And again, that took a lot of people by surprise because they're not expecting rulemaking necessarily to come out of this administration. So I am interested that he's opened the door to some rulemaking where this might land as well. So those are two things I'll be watching very closely next year.
Fair enough. So to that end, as we wrap up, what's something you'd tell every in-house counsel to pay attention to right now?
So two things we are regularly saying is watch the music that's being used in your social media, particularly with your influencers. There's a real high exposure there. We've got actually a tool we've been using to help some clients with that, but it is definitely something you need to worry about. And the second thing we're just saying, I'm not quite sure what we can do about it, but we're just telling counsel, your whole marketing team is using AI tools despite whatever policies you have in place. So be aware of it and do something about it. But it's happening and you can't just brush it under the rug.
I would also just add in the most self-serving way possible as a cybersecurity lawyer, to the extent that in-house counsel are advising or alerting regarding, we'll say, shadow IT, also talk to your CISO and confer and look at your information security policies to ensure alignment with best and recommended practices. Sorry, I can't help myself. I'm going to stop talking now.
Thank you, Daniel, for joining us. It's great to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. And we will be having you guys on our podcast eventually as well. Amy and I have been talking about that and cross-pollinating at BakerHostetler. I love it.
Can't wait.
If you have any questions for David or Nichole, their contact information is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening to Baker Hosts. Comments heard on Baker Hosts are for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. Listeners should not act upon the information provided on Baker Hosts without first consulting with a lawyer directly. The opinions expressed on Baker Hosts are those of participants appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information about our practices and experience, please visit bakerlaw.com.